Come closer. Come closer. The House of Usher, as told by a storyteller, and one of our guests. Beth.
Good evening. One thing that's always intrigued me about Edgar Allan Poe's House of Usher is why the house hated them so much. So this is a slightly adjusted version from the original. It had been a long, cold journey. The air was chilly. Sorry, I'll just wait till they finish.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Go outside.
Close the door.
It had been a long, cold journey. The road had been difficult, and despite the chilly air, the atmosphere was so close, I could hardly breathe. And now I had come to my destination. I wanted nothing more than to turn round and go back. For my destination crouched before me like a venomous toad on a small island in the middle of the black, still tarn. It was the home of my friend Roderick Usher. He had written to me, begging me to come, for he was sick in mind and in body. And he said, "Nothing but your company will restore me. I am so ill and so bereft." And because of that, I could not turn round and go back. He had been my childhood companion, my dearest friend. But now I saw his home. I wondered whether the desolation of that place, grey, yellow brick, a fortified manor house with crenellations to look like a small castle, whether maybe that had distorted his mind to make him the cold and lonely person he was, or whether the family had been so desolate and withdrawn they had walked the house. But I could not go back. I couldn't let Roderick down, and the nearest inn was more than 2 hours' ride away, and the sun was already low. I determined to be positive for Roderick's sake. I took my horse a little closer to the precipitous edge of the tarn, and I looked at the house, looking for some poetry of design. But maybe I was tired. The sun was setting behind the building. I could see nothing of beauty or design in that place. It was just empty and cold. I could see there had been gardens. There were lines of hedges and borders. And around the tarn, tall, dead trees reached up to the sky with blackened, bone-like boughs that scratched at the clouds. But I had to go on. I couldn't go back. I took my horse across the causeway. I dismounted before the house. I was determined to be logical. I looked at the thick moss that covered the walls, and from under the eaves there hung grey-green lichens like discarded grave clothes. The place seemed solid enough. I could only see one crack. It rose from its footings near the edge of the tarn. It was a small crack that zigzagged this way and that up until under the eaves, but it was certainly solid. I looked. I took a deep breath. I knocked on the great mouth-like door. It opened. A servant took my horse and my bags. I crossed the courtyard where a valet waited by the door. He welcomed me and assured me the master awaited me in the studio. He took me inside. The corridor seemed endless, black, polished stone floor. There had been fine arras hanging from the walls. These had once been embroidered with fine colours, telling tales of knights and saints and magical happenings. But time and dust and moth had done their work. Now they were just sad grey shreds of unravelled wool. The ceiling was fan-vaulted, each stopped with a weird carved face that sneered or pulled eyes and scratched its nose at us, sneering down. As we walked, our footsteps echoed, and the suits of armour on display on either side rattled in the slight breeze as we passed. We came to a grand staircase, and as we went up, a tall, stooped man with a cunning look came down. He nodded at the valet and said, "I'll see myself out." "Very well, doctor." And we continued to the top. There the valet knocked on a heavy oak door, and without waiting for an answer, he opened it. I stepped inside. The room was vast. It was more like a great hall than a studio. The windows were glazed with thick red glass, and what was left of the day's light trickled in and pooled like congealed blood on the floor. The furniture was heavy, old-fashioned, carved with weird shapes and designs. And here and there, musical instruments and books had been laid aside, a sight that would normally bring me great pleasure, promising interesting conversation, but there was something about the way the books and instruments had been set aside that told me whoever had laid them there had done it because they were just too heavy to hold. At one end of the hall, a small fire glowed in a hearth. I made for it, and as I drew closer, a tall figure stood, and a voice said, "You came. I hoped you would. Thank you." What was this? Roderick? The height and shape were correct, but so wasted, so thin. I took the proffered hand, and the cold, bony fingers wrapped around my own. I looked at him. Where was the mop of fair hair? This figure just had grey, straggly remains of hair, but the fine arched brows were there, and the strong nose. This was Roderick, but so changed. He asked me to sit and said, "Please, I will get you some food." He summoned the butler, and while I ate, he told me of his illness. He said, "It is a family malaise. Many of us have suffered from it. It is a sort of disease where everything is too big, too loud, too harsh, too strong. I can only wear clothes made of silk or fine linen. Anything else rubs my skin and tears it to shreds. I bleed. I can only eat the simplest foods and drink water. Art I can still enjoy a little. And music, only the sounds of the very softest stringed instruments played quietly. I am just falling apart. Well, I said, what do the doctors say? What pills have you had? What potions? And he said, the doctors are at a loss. But the worst of it is, my twin sister, Madeleine, she is ill too. Is that the same illness? Similar. She has a wasting illness. She can neither eat nor drink. Each day she gets up, she dresses, she goes about her duties as best she can. But each time I see her, I fear it will be her last. She is wearing away. And as he spoke, a door at the back of the hall opened, and a frail female figure crossed the room, and without acknowledging Roderick or myself, then left from a door on the other side. I looked at Roderick. Was that Madeleine? Yes, he said. She is my twin in my soul and in my heart. We have been our dearest companions and friends all our lives, and when she is gone, what will be left? What will become of me? I said, listen, friend, maybe your illness is grief for Madeleine's illness. And when at last she does die, after a time of mourning, you may then recover. Your spirits may be weighed down by her illness and your grief over it. Then Roderick looked at me and said, no, I haven't been quite honest with you. Madeleine is dying. I am dying. Because the house is killing us. Well, it made an eerie sense, but at the same time it made no sense. And I said, what do you mean the house is killing you? There is a legend, said Roderick, that many, many years ago this place was green and fertile and lush, and that there was on this island a sacred grove, and there some spirit or demon was worshipped. Priests and priestesses came, and they brought offerings, and they made their obeisance to this preacher. But over time, such pagan rituals were forgotten, and now it is just a folk memory. But when my family bought the land, it was good land. They built the house. But since then, nothing has flourished. And we believe that demon, that spirit that was worshipped on this island wants vengeance. And that is why the stones of the House of Usher are folding in to crush the flesh of the House of Usher. There is no hope. The following morning, I determined to cheer Roderick up, to lift him out of this malaise. I found books and paintings. I found musical instruments that played very, very softly and lightly. I engaged him in conversation, and for a brief moment he smiled. The next day, he wanted to play music. We found a soft-sounding, softly strung, small guitar. Oh, he played. He played like angels was plucking the strings. He played with such skill, such dexterity. It broke my heart to listen, for his music told of the agony of his soul. I thought, if that's what is suffering inside, if I was suffering that, I would be dying too, however exquisite the notes. The following day, he asked to paint. And he painted a picture of a long corridor. Without being told, I knew it was deep underground. There were no windows, no doors, no decoration or style or art of any kind. It was just white and straight. And it was lit, not with sconces and torches or lanterns, but with a searing, harsh, white light that scoured your soul to look at it. The following day, Roderick wanted to sing. He chose a soft, dirge-like melody, and he extemporized a song of his own creation, of a king who had been wise and good and kind. He had looked after all his people. He was loved and honored. The ground was fertile. The crops were rich and the barns were full. But one day a jealous spirit wound through the villages and the towns, bringing disease and plague and mold and decay, and everything shriveled and died. And on came this creature, sliding onwards ever, bringing death and destruction, until it came to the king himself. And despite his goodness and his wholesome spirit, this creature slithered inside and devoured him from inside out, until he was nothing but a skin full of living bones. But if you dared to look through the windows of that castle, you would see 2 red eyes watching you. That, said Roderick, as he finished the song, is the story of our family. I was finding it difficult to cheer him on, but I would not give up. I planned all sorts of pleasant walks and interesting conversations for the following day, but at breakfast Roderick seemed edgy and distracted. And when we had eaten, I asked him what was wrong. And he said, Madeleine died last night. I'm so sorry. So sorry. What can I do to help? Can I help organize the funeral? May I attend the funeral? No, said Roderick, there will be no funeral. Why? Because, Roderick replied, the doctors here are men of science. And I respect that, but they are so bemused by Madeleine's illness that I fear that once she is buried or interred in the family crypt, that within a few days there will be, unfortunately, grave robbers. They will take her away and dissect her, and I cannot let that happen to my beloved sister. What are you going to do? I asked. Well, said Roderick, what I shall do is, deep below this castle, there are many cellars. They are cold, they are dry, they are dark. I have ordered a temporary coffin to be made. If you are willing to help, then help me lay her body in this coffin and take it down, and we shall shut her in a deep, cold cellar just for 2, maybe 3 weeks. And then when the doctors have given up searching for her corpse, I will have her taken away to another place, a village far from here, where her name means nothing. And there she will be buried with all proper ceremony and respect. What could I do but agree? We went up to Madeleine's room. It was dark. Roger pulled back the curtains, and there she lay on the bed, pale as the linen on which she lay. She was dressed in a white gown. And as we picked her up, I realized rigor mortis had not yet set in, for her limbs were still supple. We laid her in this long box, this temporary coffin. Roderick and I put the lid on, and lifting it between us, we carried it down the staircase. And in the great hall, a servant met us with a torch in one hand and an open door in the other. He led the way down the dark steps into the cellars. We followed as carefully as we could, one step at a time, lest we drop our precious cargo on the cold stone steps. Down and down we went, until I reckoned we were in a room pretty well beneath my own by my calculations. We went in, the servant put the torch into a sconce. We laid the coffin on trestles laid there ready. The servant bowed and left us alone. Roderick said in years gone by this room was used for storing gunpowder. It is the driest cellar we have. See, it's lined with copper. Even the door is copper lined. Then we lifted off the lid of the coffin, for Roderick wished to make his farewells. And by now rigor must have started to set in, for on her cold, still lips, the skin seemed to have pulled back to give her a semblance of a smile. And the mocking red fire of the torches cast an image of a blush on her cheeks. Roderick knelt by the coffin and wept and prayed. I stayed back and wondered, for they were so alike. Roderick would be devastated without her. I did not know what I could do to possibly save him. I watched as he cried, and together we prayed, and then we put the lid on the coffin and screwed it down tightly. We left the room, and as we shut it, the copper lining screamed and screeched on the stone floor. We went up the stairs and back into the light, and Roderick went silently to his own room. The following day, Roderick seemed to pace around, and he seemed agitated and fidgety, and he kept saying, "Did you hear that? Surely you heard that." But I heard nothing. The day passed. He didn't seem to want company, but I followed him at a distance, keeping him in sight, making sure that he did not fall or faint. The next day was worse, and the day after was dreadful. He staggered and slipped, and he seemed torn apart. But the fourth day, oh, the fourth day, there was a storm. The wind howled like 1,000 wolves. The rain lashed at the castle walls. It seemed as if the glass would break with the hail and the rain which battered and the winds that clattered. We both sat alone in our own rooms to read by the fire, for it was such a heart-rending day. Darkness came early, and with it the wind intensified. And I went to where the window, for the shutters were going bang, 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 bang. I opened the window to grab them and to tie them shut. And there, on the tarn, there were gaseous dancing wraiths, pale yellow and green, and they seemed to be mocking in their dance. And as I watched, astounded, Roderick came in. He came over to the window and looked out, wide-eyed, and pointed and said, "See, you have seen them too." I said, "Listen, that's just methane gas. It's nothing to be worried about, and the storm is making the gaseous you know, the gas dance and move. It's nothing weird, I promise. I pulled the shutters shut, closed the window, and led Roderick to come and sit by the fire. I put another log on and picked up a book at random and said, "Listen, I will read to you. This is one of your favourite tales." I had no idea whether it was or not, but I wished to keep him happy and peaceful. It was the Lay of Sir Ethelred. It was the story of a knight who'd been promised a shield that would protect him from all harm. He had travelled north and south and east and west until on a night such as this, when a terrible storm was battering and pursuing him and the river was rising and trees were falling in the forest, he was desperate for shelter for him and his horse. And he came at last to a place where he knew a hermit lived. He didn't hold out much hope, for this hermit was angry and curmudgeonly and unkind and not very welcoming to strangers. But what choice did Ethelred have? He knocked on the door, and despite the fact there was light underneath, there was no answer. He knocked again and again. By this time he was desperate. He took his mace from his saddle and began to bash and bash and bash at the door. And as I told the story, I was sure somewhere I heard wood splintering. It was probably just a roof beam giving way. We discover a very wet part of the house in the morning. And I read on. Inside, there was no hermit cell. It was not dark. The light was not from candles. There was no open Bible. There was no hermit. His room had been transformed to a huge hall, piled high with gold and silver and jewels, and round about it all coiled a snaking dragon with red eyes and sharp, gnashing teeth. And it hissed and it spat at Ethelred. But Ethelred drew his sword and swiped and slashed at the beast until at last he had cut its neck. Purple blood squirted out, melting the gold and silver into useless twisted blackened metal. The creature howled and pulled back its head for one last bite, but Ethelred ran up the pile of metal and took a big slice and cut off the creature's head. It fell screaming and screeching to the ground. But as I read it, I heard screeching, screaming somewhere beneath my feet. I looked up. Had Roderick heard it? He gave no indication he had, so I read on. As Ethelred stood on the pile of treasure, he looked around and saw there on the wall was the very shield which he had been looking for. He reached up to grab it, but it fell beneath his fingers and came clattering down to the ground. And he ran down the pile of metal to reach it. But as he did, Roderick said, "Stop." That story you're reading is prophetic. How do you mean? I asked. Well, he said, we buried Madeline alive. What? Well, let's go and help her. We've got to do something. Come on, come on. I got up from my chair. But Roderick said, no, it's too late. What do you mean too late? When did you know? He said, I knew the day after we buried her. I could hear her scratching at the coffin lid and calling. Well, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you tell me? The house wouldn't let me. Okay, I said, well, we've got to do something. But Roderick said no. When you read of the wood shattering, did you not hear wood shattering? That was her breaking through the coffin lid at last. And when the dragon died and it screeched, did you not hear the screeching of that copper door against the stone? And when Ethelred ran up the stairs of metal and gold, Madeline was climbing the stairs. And even now, she's at the door and she's looking for me. And as he spoke, the door opened. And there she stood, wide-eyed, gaunt-faced, her hands and fingers broken and bloody, her gown besmirched with gore. Roderick sprang to his feet and said, "Madeline, Madeline, I'm so sorry." She took one step towards him and fell on him, knocking him backwards. He hit his head on the corner of the hearth, and blood oozed from his eyes and ears and nose and mouth. I ran to him, but he was dead. I lifted the Lady Madeline off, but she was dead too. I did not hesitate for one moment. I pulled on my boots, my jacket, I grabbed my bag. I left that room. I ran down the stairs, along the corridor. I came to the front door. I ran across the courtyard. I went to the stables and took the very first horse I could find. I mounted it bareback and rode out of the courtyard across the causeway. And as I did, I heard the most awful howling, screeching, grinding sound. And my way was lit with red. I gave my horse its head. I turned back and saw the storm had cleared, and now there was a red setting moon. And as I watched, the crack I had noticed on the first day split apart, and the house was falling into the tarn. The way was lit with blood-red moonlight. And as the stones fell and the glass shattered and the wood snapped, the dark waves of the tarn surged and rose up like grabbing fingers pulling the stones down into the water. My horse ran. I held on. We reached the other side. And I turned back. And there, in the ripples and surges of the water, those gaseous rays danced, mocking, celebrating the fall of the house.